Hi, welcome to video 1 in section 1. In this video, we're going to talk about why migrations, purpose, and usage. So let's just dive right into why. Migrations are primarily created for a code-first metaphor where we design and build our applications, services, and then using migrations, we synchronize those changes of our models into the back-end database. And we continue to apply migrations and update the database as a matter of course. So what that looks like here, and we'll take a closer look at that. We have a design phase, and then we create our code. That code exposes models, our constructs for holding content, and those models then we use migrations to deploy them into our development database. Now, later on, when we're looking at applying our migrations in a subsequent video, we'll show you how we'd actually take those and apply them to production via scripts and not this live migration mechanism. So let's dive right into building our first application with our data services layer using migrations. To do this, we'll start off with Visual Studio 2022 and create a new project. This new project will be a class library targeting .NET Standard or .NET Core, and we will target .NET Core. We're going to call this Shopping Cart EF or Entity Framework. It is a .NET 6 project. And let's just get a little bit closer in on that. And we can see the project that was created. We'll delete the class that it had created by default in here. We'll create a couple of folders to organize our code. We'll create a entities folder to hold our classes, and we'll create a data folder which will hold our data connection. So what's a data connection? That is a class which derives from DB context. So we're going to call this Shopping Cart DS for data service. We'll make it a public class, and it'll be derived from DB context. Now we haven't declared DB context via using in this file yet, so we get the chevrons below it giving us a warning that it hasn't been declared. Well, we can't declare it quite yet because we actually need to add those extensions. So let's go to our NuGet Package Manager, and we're going to use the console. Now, this is necessary we can use either Package Manager console or the Package Manager window. I'm going to use the console because it's easier to see exactly what I'm going to be doing. So first thing we need to do is we need to install the Entity Framework Core tools, which will give us our migrations as well as our DB context. And so now we need to still not there, so we need to add another console, another package. And this time it's going to be our data source. So we don't have a DB context yet until we identify what our data service is going to be. So we're going to use SQL Server. So that'll add all the necessary components into our library. And now when we look at our chevrons here, we can now see using Microsoft Entity Framework is available. So now that we've got all our libraries installed, we can go ahead and create our default constructor. Now, the migrations requires a default constructor or parameterless constructor because it runs at design time, not just runtime. So at design time, meaning while we're coding and developing our system, migrations actually has to be able to instantiate our data service so that it can connect and identify what the backend database is. So we're going to create a public method or public class here to hold our connection string. And actually, we'll just make that private. We don't need to expose it, although we'll be removing it later on anyway. And then we'll initialize that in our constructor. So let me just get the code for that. Bring that over. So now we have our connection string. And we are calling our database shopping cart dev. And we're using integrated security to get at it. Now we're using it on dev1, so that's my machine, and we look at my machine, and we don't have any shopping cart dev database on here yet. Now we need one further bit of code on here, and that is to derive or override the onConfigure method and letting it know what our chosen backend data store is going to be. So in this particular case, we've already installed SQL Server, so we have this ability to use SQL Server as one of the options. If we had installed SQLite, we would have more options on this as well. But right now, if we just look at our options, we only have the one use SQL Server. And we're passing in our connection string, and that should be enough to create our first object, or create the database. But let's go ahead and create a couple of entities. We'll create an order entity. Make it public. We'll add a couple of attributes for it so that it has some values to propagate. So now we've got our very simple order class. We've got a shopping cart data service. We've overridden onConfigure, so it knows how to find and connect to the database. Now we can actually go ahead. We can go ahead and create our first migration, which will only establish the database definition. So let's go ahead and do a add migration initial create. So what we'll see from that is it's created this initial migration. Up and down are the mechanisms that would be used to apply or undo, roll back changes that are included in this particular migration. You see in the migrations folder, it's got the initial create, which is what we have here, and it's applied a timestamp on it so it knows exactly when it was done. So this is our sequential list of things that need to be applied to the database, and then the snapshot is what is actually going to be occurring and happening, done to the backend database. So in order for this to be executed, we need to do the database update command. So I'll just quickly snag that rather than typing it in. So update database. So that'll push those changes to the database. If we look to our database now, or our data repository, refresh the database, we see shopping cart dev has now been created. It doesn't have any tables in it, just the migration history from the entity frameworks. So now we're going to actually enhance the data store so that we now include the orders class as something that we want to refer to. So we'll add that into our definition. Order hasn't been referenced yet, so we'll just add a reference to our new order. And so we're having a DB set, which is a entity framework table structure, and it's called order. And the collection will be called orders. So now that we've defined that, if we do create a new migration called, well, let's just call it what we want. So we'll just do add migration create order object. So that creates a new migration for us. So we can see over in our right-hand pane in our Solution Explorer, we've got create order object preceded by or prefixed by the date timestamp of when that migration was created. Now we can apply this migration to the database. So we'll do an update database. So that pushes those changes to the database. And now if we look at our database and we refresh our tables, we notice orders has now been created. And it's got a primary key called order ID and customer ID as at bar chart. As a final note, there is also an ability, if we have a situation where we have an entity that is defined in a different DB context, but we need to make use of it in this context, and we don't want it to be exposed or exposed through migrations within our data service or our this existing DB context. So we need to mechanism to exclude it from the migrations. So let's just go ahead and create something and then exclude it from our migrations. So we're going to create a parts class. And our part class will have just a couple of fields in it. Public. And we will modify our data service to also have a part object here. Call it parts. But the idea here is it's actually derived or defined in a different data service. So we're going to override the onModelCreating method and tell it to exclude parts. So we've override onModelCreating. We're talking to the model builder. It's passed in. And we're telling it to override the parts entity, which relates to the parts table, and exclude it from migration. So next time we do a migration, add migration empty, no change. So we've added, and we've got a couple of warnings in here. We'll deal with those in a subsequent video. But if we look at our database now and refresh our tables. So if we look at our tables, we notice that the parts table hasn't been created. It has been successfully excluded. So that's all we're going to look at for this first section, and we'll see you in the next video.